fascinating. So please, a big hand for Terry Boardman.
Good morning. Thanks very much, Andy. Yeah, that talk was quite something for me too, because my whole slide presentation sort of collapsed before it started. So I was suddenly in the situation of having to, as it were, improvise on the spot the whole presentation, which was great in many respects. But it was one of those on-the-edge moments, you know, for a speaker. Okay, there's a lot to say today about this problem, very complex problem, so I'll get stuck into it straight away. Now, when I was 15 at school, I and a few other friends, we started a little political party, only in our school. This was in the mid-60s, and basically we called our party the European Nationalist Party. What that meant was that we were all tired of the way that Europe, which we were all interested in, I was very interested in history and current events already, the way that Europe was interfered with and its destiny blocked, prevented, and distorted by the actions of the United States and the Soviet Union. And we wanted both of those countries to get out of Europe and leave Europe to be itself. That was our very naive motivation. And in particular, I, in those days, was in favor of Europe becoming a federal United States of Europe, like the USA, because that was the only model of, the only model I could see for a possible future for Europe. Later, I realized that that is, in fact, not the way forward. And so, later on, I became aware of a different possibility for Europe, and that's what I'd like to share with you in the second half of the presentation today. So, British independence from the European Union, without independence from Britain's real controller, which is the United States, is only an empty word. Britons have to decide whether they want to kick the 250-year-old addictive and chauvinist habit of world domination. The way forward for Europe is not as a unitary federal state, which Eurocrats have always aimed for, a supernation state called Europe. Rather, it is as an associative threefold confederation between America and Asia, which can help America and Asia relate to each other, because they're clearly not doing that at the moment. A Europe-wide economy and a Europe-wide cultural life, but with national political and legal sovereignty for the peoples of Europe. The threefold social organism, that is separation, but also the interrelation of the three spheres of culture, politics, and economy, based on a moral economy. This is the healthy model for the 21st century, and that's what I'll be looking at in the second part of the talk. But first, we need to understand how we got where we are. And so I'd like to be sharing with you now some thoughts which were certainly not, as Andy was saying, presented either in 1975 at the referendum then, or like in last year's referendum. So let's start with Benjamin Disraeli and very quickly come up to the present. 1872, his speech at Crystal Palace, he said, "The Briton faced a choice then, quote, whether you will be content to be a comfortable England, modeled and molded upon continental principles, or whether you will be a great country, an imperial country." This was the temptation which he dangled in front of the British people at Crystal Palace. And this led on to Victoria being made Empress of India by Disraeli in 1877, and to the foundation of the Imperial Federation League in 1884, which is in favor of creating a united empire, one force in the world which could stand in the world against those forces which Disraeli and other members of the elite saw would be dominating the 20th century, namely America and Russia, these great, enormous powers. Only if the empire was forged as one unity could Britain hold its own in the future. And then we had the 1887 Golden Jubilee, and 1897 Diamond Jubilee, celebrating the same principle. So imperialism was very much the tenor of the times, and it was very much a racialist imperialism, as I'm sure you know. So it made the British feel good about themselves, whatever class they were, vis-a-vis people of other races. Very much an affair of vanity. Now, some people were listening to Benjamin Disraeli, in particular these characters. And there on the left you have Cecil Rhodes, the mining magnate. On the right, somebody you may not know, the campaigning radical journalist W.T. Stead. In the middle, Lord Alfred Milner, who would go on to continue the Rhodes's motivations and impulses after Rhodes's death in 1902. Below him, Lord Esher, who was also would work with Stead and Rhodes and Milner in doing that, and at the bottom, providing some finance, a crucial situation in Rhodes's career, Lord Rothschild. He was not so much involved with the whole thing, but he did give crucial financial assistance at a particular point in Rhodes's development. It was really Milner, the man at the top, Alfred Lord Milner, who is the key figure in this, because he goes on to create the Rhodes-Milner Group. I'm sure you've heard of the Rhodes Scholarships, for example. And Milner then creates a particular group of talented young men around him in South Africa, and they then go on to continue Rhodes's impulses. And what were they? Very simple. He believed that Britain, the English-speaking people, should dominate the entire world, and that only when the British people did this would there be peace in the world. The British Navy would run things, eventually, would be the police force. Then there would be peace, and we would dominate the entire world. And we also, it was essential, he believed, that we had to connect ourselves, reunite ourselves with the United States. So Rhodes dies in 1902, and Stead, in 1902, publishes a book called The United States of Europe on the Eve of the Parliament of Peace. That was published in 1899. And in that book, he asked the question, what is England's mission abroad? And he answered, to maintain the European concert, that germ of the United States of Europe, against isolated action, meaning not to let the individual European countries go their own way, but to make sure that they cooperated together under the whim, if you will, or the orders of the English-speaking people. To establish a Roman peace among the dark-skinned races of Asia, Polynesia, and Africa. So again, very much the Roman model, the Pax Romanum in the background, Pax Britannicum, Pax Americanum. To unite all branches of the English-speaking race in an Anglo-Saxon bond, and to spread liberty, civilization, and Christianity throughout the world. In 1902, he writes The Americanization of the World, in which he triumphantly declares that the world is becoming more and more Americanized, and he gives many examples of that. So he was optimistic about this Americanization of the world. And in that same year, 1902, the elites of Britain and America really began to knit themselves together with the founding of the Pilgrims Society, Transatlantic. This is the Transatlantic Elite organization. We could say this is really the elite of the elite. Still exists. Queen Elizabeth is the patron of this organization. And this was really the creme de la creme of the elite of the two countries. And out of this organization came much more. But it was an organization through which the smaller group of the Rhodes-Milner organization were able to have their effects. There's their logo on the right. You see the eagle on the rump of the horse, led by the lion. That's Geoffrey Chaucer leading the way, a symbol of Anglo-American culture, the English language. So the eagle is still following the lion at this point. Of course, after the First World War, the roles would be reversed. Hic et ubique, of course, means here and everywhere, and that was the intention. But it was not only the Rhodes-Milner Group who were active in all of this. Behind the scenes, a little less visible, were the actions of a very powerful family and the network of connections to which they had access. And it was through this network of connections of the Cecil family that the Rhodes-Milner Group was really able to make its way through the elite. Because the Rhodes and Milner, these were middle-class men. They were not aristocrats. But the Cecils, father and son, they're at the top. You see William and Robert Cecil, father and son, secretaries of state of Elizabeth I and James I. These were the men who, as it were, prepared the opening of the curtain for the British Empire. Robert Cecil in particular, who made peace with Spain, which allowed Britain to pursue its trading purposes in Asia, Indian Ocean, and also, unwittingly, as far as Robert was concerned, because he had his eyes more on Asia, it also enabled the British to plant their first colony in North America, Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. So this was a remarkable event which those two did, and I could say a lot more about them, but time is pressing. Just want to flag up that you have, at the opening of the curtain of the British Empire, these two members of this family. And then at the beginning of the end, we could say, although they didn't see it that way at the time, at the beginning of the end, the closing of the curtain of the British Empire, around about 1900, we have two more Cecils, top right there. This time uncle and nephew, Lord Salisbury and his nephew, Arthur Balfour. And these two men took certain actions in relation to Britain's foreign policy, which certainly led on to the First World War. A diplomatic revolution was brought about whereby Britain's traditional enemies became Britain's traditional friends, and Britain's traditional friends became Britain's traditional enemies. And this scenario was brought about between 1887 and 1907, and 7 years later, in 1914, we had the First World War. This, again, is a very, very complex and fascinating story, what these two men brought about. I would just also flag up that the Cecils, both 400 years ago and in 1900, were intimately connected with the founding and the running and organization of the British intelligence agencies, the Secret Service. The present Lord Salisbury, Marquis, 7th Marquis there at the bottom, he also is very active. It's due to him that we have the 92 hereditary peers still in the House of Lords, for example. 1999, that happened. I'd just like to flag up a couple of interesting points, just to show you the connections between these two men. The Rhodes-Milner Group effected a coup d'etat in this country, which is hardly ever talked about, in December 1916, which was determined not to make peace with Germany and to fight the war to the bitter end. That was the purpose of this coup d'etat, December 1916, which brought Lloyd George to power as a figurehead behind the Rhodes-Milner Group-dominated cabinet, war cabinet, special war cabinet. In that new cabinet, which took power after the coup, so to speak, Lord Balfour and Arthur Balfour became Foreign Secretary. And in a letter he had written to Theodore Roosevelt in 1909, he wrote the following, advocating an Anglo-Saxon confederation. Quote, "In a loose federation, neither will sacrifice its own individuality. There will simply be imposed on English, American, Canadian, South African, and Australian national sentiment a common Anglo-Saxon patriotism. If they unite against the rest of the world, they will be beyond attack." Now, please keep in mind what we have today, the so-called Five Eyes, US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, who share intelligence information only amongst themselves and not with their fellow NATO members or members of other such security organizations. So that's already been realized, you see. De facto, the English-speaking military are already, in effect, one military. Because today you cannot fight a war without the kind of intelligence capabilities which we have. Going on, such a federation, Balfour said, would be a sea empire with no land borders to defend. It would possess the thinly populated areas and all the seas. The Federal Council would only deal with the question of preference, that's free trade, and defense. No permanent government would be required. Such a confederation would be practically unassailable and would dominate the world. It would practically dictate peace by sea to the rest of the world, and the balance of power would be permanently upset. So this is a unipolar domination of the world, just as Cecil Rhodes had wanted, which Balfour is arguing for to Theodore Roosevelt, who was very Anglophile himself. And Roosevelt played a key role in bringing about the election of Woodrow Wilson in the United States election of 1912, and that led on to the founding of the Federal Reserve. Well, one could go on about that. And then at a meeting of the Pilgrim Society, once America had come into the war, the Pilgrim Society I showed you just before, this elite of the elite group, Balfour said, as an address, "We both spring from the same root. Are we not bound together forever? Will not our descendants, when they come to look back on this unique episode in the history of the world, say that among the incalculable circumstances which it produced, the most beneficent and the most permanent is perhaps that we are brought together and united for one common purpose, in one common understanding, the two great branches of the English-speaking race. This is a theme which absorbs my thoughts day and night. It is a theme which moves me more, I think, than anything connected with public affairs in all my long experience. Now, we're familiar with Balfour because we know of his Balfour Declaration in connection with Zionism and the home for the Jewish people in Palestine. We're not so familiar with this. But for Balfour, the most important thing was that the First World War brought together and bonded the Anglo-Saxon peoples. This is a thoroughly racial and chauvinist imperial aim which he had. The same goal as Cecil Rhodes. And so after the First World War, we see Britain and America coming together more and more intensely. J.P. Morgan, of course, had been financing the British government, which was already more or less bankrupt by 1915 in the war. And then the man on the right there is Walter Hines Page, the US ambassador, who played a key role in bringing the US into the war. Fascinating. I strongly recommend you to read his letters, particularly the ones he wrote to Woodrow Wilson. He was so important, in fact, that the British elite dedicated a plaque to him in Westminster Abbey, the home of Britain's monarchs and some of its heroes and great artistic figures. That's how important he was. And all of British elite were there because he died at the end of the war in December 1918. And out of this Rhodes-Milner group, which I already mentioned, I don't have time to go into how this group was put together. You can read all about that in the books of Carroll Quigley, for example, which some of you may know, The Anglo-American Establishment and Tragedy and Hope. But out of that group came the two leading think tanks of the British and American establishments, Chatham House in Britain, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and Council on Foreign Relations in the USA. And from the late 1920s onwards, increasingly, these were always sister organizations, and they were intended to function as such, to coordinate and combine the foreign policies, the bipartisan foreign policies of the two countries, to keep them on the same page, from behind the scenes, so that the governments, the so-called democratically elected governments, would continue to reflect the policies which the Rhodes-Milner Group and their American confreres were seeking to bring forward. And from 1930s onwards, the working in tandem of these two organizations progressed even further, to the point where today you could argue that the two wings of the foreign policy establishments are more or less the same thing. One of the symbols of that Anglo-American connection is, of course, Winston Churchill, and whose mother was American. And after the Second World War, he gave three great speeches about the theme of European Union. Again, we're hardly ever told about these speeches. And only a few sentences from these speeches are quoted, but not the ones which I'm going to read to you now. He said in the Albert Hall on the 14th of May, 1947, "We do not, of course, pretend that united Europe provides the final and complete solution to all the problems of international relationships. The creation of an authoritative, all-powerful world order is the ultimate aim towards which we must strive. Unless some effective world super-government can be set up and brought quickly into action, the prospects for peace and human progress are dark and doubtful. But let there be no mistake upon the main issue. Without a united Europe, there is no sure prospect of world government. It is the urgent and indispensable step towards the realization of that ideal." You see, the American and British elite were actually looking to create a Europe, a united Europe, which would be modeled on the kind of tightly centralized United States which had emerged after the American Civil War. And then they wished to expand that to the world stage through such organizations as the League of Nations and the United Nations, which were again, both of them, set up by the Rhodes-Milner Group and their allies in what could be called the Cecil Family Network. All of this is particularly well documented in Quigley's book, The Anglo-American Establishment. But it was not only the Anglo-Americans who were working towards the founding of the European Union project, it was also what we could call the Catholic forces in Europe. One of the key figures here was Count Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who deserves to be much better known, the founder of the Pan-Europa Union, Pan-European Union in 1923. Again, I don't have much time to go into this, but you can see there the original flag of the Pan-Europa Union at the top of the three. And then the circle of stars was added to that later on, and you can see how then the original sun and the sun cross was omitted in the early 1950s when Turkey joined NATO and didn't wish to be associated with an organization that had a cross at its center. But this was very much not what I would call a true Christian impulse. It was a Christian impulse which, for Coudenhove-Kalergi, would create a united Europe governed by the spirituality of the Roman Catholic Church. It would be a Europe which would omit Britain and would omit Russia. It would be a European United States in which would all be very much a kind of a mixed-up entity in which a new elite would be created out of a combination of the old European aristocracy and members of the Jewish elite of the various European countries. You can read all of this in Coudenhove's works. In Switzerland, 1947, he said in an address, "At the heart of Europe, we have met in open conspiracy," to use the words of H.G. Wells. "The purpose of this conspiracy is to organize immediately across Europe the parliamentary majorities that would be strong and stable enough to impose upon governments the full implementation of our program, the European Union within the framework of the UN." Now, these kind of things, I would argue, were not put to the British people when Heath took us in 73, nor at the time of the referendum in 75, and nor the referendum last year. You can read a very interesting, illuminating paper by Richard J. Aldrich of University of Nottingham, the OSS, the CIA, and European Unity, the American Committee on the United Europe in 1948-1960. And there he details exactly how the Americans drove and funded the whole European project in the late 40s and 50s. Because the European project, whatever the Catholics wanted from their perspective, which was basically to resurrect the Holy Roman Empire, governed by Roman Catholic impulses. Otto von Habsburg, for example, the son of the last Habsburg emperor, was one of the leaders of the Pan-Europa Union after Coudenhove-Kalergi. Not only from this Catholic side, but he details, Aldrich, he shows how he focuses on how the Americans created this European Union because it coincided with their impulses, what they wanted, which is basically for their economic purposes, markets for their goods, but also, and above all, to keep the Germans down under, so to speak, and to keep the Germans apart from the Russians. We'll come to that in a minute. And, of course, also to keep Europe under America's wing. I don't have time, unfortunately, to quote to you some of the fascinating things from Aldrich's paper, but he does go into considerable detail, including details of the actual particular amounts of the money. And he points out how most of the people who are involved in these various groups, which included the Bilderberg Group, for example, the European Movement, and Jean Monnet's Action Committee for United States of Europe, that these groups were organized and led by people who all had an intelligence background, Secret Service background in World War II. Some of this was revealed by the Daily Telegraph in the year 2000, when declassified documents, CIA documents, were made available. But the rest of the media basically didn't touch the story, and it just disappeared, which is why it did not surface last year. Here's another one on how the MI6 pushed Britain to join Europe. This is from the Telegraph, 27th April 1997. or how the CIA supported Britain staying in the European Union in 1975. 1993, we see an interesting article which sort of shows the situation very clearly in images. This is from The Economist, which right through this whole period since the 50s has been a major driving force in the media to have Britain go into the European Union, the European project. So we see on the left there, America and Europe shown as a sort of Greek princess, Europa, with umbrellas, and above them are these threatening clouds. The article is called Weathering the Storm. December 92, January 93, double issue. And then in the middle we see Europa and Uncle Sam with their umbrellas guarding themselves against these three storm clouds. And now we see what these three storm clouds are. These faces are clearly identifiable as Chinese, Russians, and Muslims. And then in the final page, we see the three clouds have disappeared, and we have Uncle Sam with his arm around Europa, and Europa's cute little umbrella is nestling under Uncle Sam's big umbrella. Big Uncle is guarding and taking care of and protecting little Princess Europa. And this is the goal, you see, that the European Union is to be united under the domination of the United States. Or we could say rather, as Cecil Rhodes would see it, under the domination of the English-speaking peoples. The Economist, 1995, in need of fastening. Please notice the heart there at the center of the zipper. Very cute, very heartwarming. And the leader of The Economist said, "It is not just good commercial relations, but something like a shared foreign and security policy, a new NATO of tomorrow. It is towards this, and not just towards TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Association, that the Allies' eyes should be turning." So the Cold War had only just finished. The Warsaw Pact had just been wound down, but they're already planning a strengthened transatlantic NATO. Now, finally, before I move to the second part, I want to just point you to two I consider them very, very important pointers for what's happening right now and on into the future. Some of you may have seen these already, particularly the first. George Friedman, who runs a strategic analysis organization, mainly for the purposes of investors and business people, called Stratfor, Strategic Forecasting. And in the 3rd of February 2015, he gave a fascinating lecture in Chicago. And this man is extremely well connected. He really understands what's going on. And he gave an overview of the present geopolitical situation, and then it came to the Q&A. And in the Q&A, somebody asked him, "Is ISIS an existential threat for the United States?" And he said, "No, ISIS is not an existential threat for the United States, for this, that, and the other reason." And then he could have stopped there. But you see that he almost makes a decision to say more. And he tells us what the primordial threat to the United States is. That's his words, primordial threat. The primordial existential threat. And he said, the primordial threat to the United States is the combination of Germany and Russia. And it is vital for the United States to keep these two apart. And for that purpose, the United States fought World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And I think when we really think about that, when we really look into that, and then we realize that it was not just the Americans that fought it for those reasons, but also the British. Because we can find that Lord Alfred Milner, for example, financed Halford Mackinder, the British imperial geographer, the founder of Anglo-Saxon geopolitics, who in 1904 gave a keynote lecture at the Royal Geographical Society, where he lays out the fundaments of British geopolitics. And the Americans are still essentially following this, what he laid out there today. And the key for Mackinder was precisely this, that the British and the Americans have to combine to keep apart the Germans and the Russians, or the Russians and the Japanese. In other words, the Russians, with all of their potential human and natural resources potential, have to be kept away from the formidable forces of intellect and will. One might also say spiritual willpower, which one sees within the Germans and the Japanese people. If those two things are combined, then American and British world domination is at threat. And that's why since World War II, it has been essential from the American geostrategic perspective to keep the Germans and the Japanese thoroughly under control, under American control. So Friedman really gave away, I think, an essential key to understanding the 20th and 21st century geopolitics, which we've all lived through and are still living through. If you think of what's going on at the moment in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, NATO tanks on the borders of Russia, and so forth. And the other thing I would draw your attention to is a lecture given by Andrea Bosco. I'm sure many of you have not heard of this man. He's hardly known. Even Friedman's lecture has not received much attention from the mainstream media, of course, because they don't want the population to know this. Bosco, you can hardly find him at all on the internet. He keeps a very low profile. But he's an academic who busies himself burrowing in the European academic undergrowth, actually continually working week after week, month after month, for European federalism. And he is the Jean Monnet Professor of Economy at the University of Florence. But he's also the director, since 1988, of the Lothian Foundation. Lord Lothian, Philip Kerr, was a key member of the Rhodes-Milner Group from the early 19th century. He was Lloyd George's private secretary. He drafted and wrote the so-called War Guilt Clause of Versailles, and he became the head of the Rhodes Scholarship. He worked for the Rhodes-Milner impulses right through until he became ambassador to the US in 1940. And he was a keen worker for the whole theme of Anglo-American federalism, and as a result also for United Europe. And Bosco, therefore, as a representative of this organization, the Lothian Group, he gives this talk in Latvia in 2014. And this is also fascinating. I strongly recommend you to watch this, because he talks about the enlargement of the European Union. I'll just quote a few things. It's not going to shrink, he said, it's going to enlarge. It's going to take in Turkey, it's going to take in the Ukraine, it's going to take in the Middle East, the whole of the Middle East. It's going to take in the South. The EU, he said, might enlarge toward North Africa, candidates like Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt. So let's figure out a union of 50 states, he says. And then at the end of his speech, he also includes Israel and Palestine. I cannot say a date, but some people in this room might say a union of 50 member states, like the US. And then comes the important thing. But we shall have a clash with Russia. I want to remind you of our history, he said. Without the existence of the Soviet Union, we would never become as we did. We had enormous pressure from the US to get united. Jean Monnet was in Washington between 1940 and 43, and he was persuaded by American intellectuals and civil servants to go back to Europe and work for European unity. The Americans had a fundamental influence on our business in getting united. I regard Putin, he said, as the most formidable factor for European political union. We have to get a political union, a federal constitution. Now, do you see what that means? On the one hand, he's showing us that Stalin and Putin, Russia, was essential in providing the counterweight to producing this new entity between America and Russia. So it's necessary to have a hostile force in the East in order to create a threat, a sense of danger, so that then the elites can use this, as they use the mass media, to make the populations of Europe full of fear, to bind together in this European Union, which will be bounded close through NATO and other organizations to the United States. So that's the role of the Russians and Putin for people like the inheritors of the Rhodes-Milner impulse. But what has he spoken about, ladies and gentlemen? He's actually envisaged the recreation of the Roman Empire, has he not? Only this time it'll be even bigger Roman Empire because it will have within its borders territories which were never in the Roman Empire. And this is the goal. Just as the British elite who all went to public schools, as you know, they all had classical models from Greece and Rome, the Athenian Commonwealth, the Empire of Rome. These are their intellectual models. Their minds were full of these models. And they saw Britain as the future, and then America as the future empire of our time. And at the time of just before 9/11, before Iraq War, many in the American elite were triumphantly talking in the same imperial terms, quite openly. Now you might think, oh, well, that's just the dream of an Italian professor, but no, it isn't. Because if we go back to 2007, we find The Economist saying exactly the same thing. Looking at Europe 50 years on, and then imagining Europe 50 years into the future. Europe in 2057. And The Economist says, yes, that Europe will increase to take in the Balkans and Turkey. How might it look in 100 years' time? It speaks of, then it puts itself, The Economist often likes to do this, to imagine the future, because it knows that thoughts are important. So you put certain thoughts out into the world, and you get the public used to thinking these thoughts. So it imagines Europe, the EU, in 2057. It talks about the collapse of the dollar, round about our time now. And then it says, even more crucial were Germany's and France's efforts later in that decade, the second decade of this millennium, under Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. Perhaps today we could say Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, because basically he's no different, respectively, to push through economic reforms. That's what they're going to do. They're going to centralize and tighten the European Union even further. These reforms, says The Economist, produced a sharp fall in unemployment just as Europe began to enjoy a productivity spurt from the spread of information technology. The eventual result was a growing labor shortage, which was not resolved until the arrival of Turkey and Ukraine as full members in 2025. Now you may think, oh, that's fantasy, that's not going to happen. But folks, you know, in 1887, if you had said that in 20 years, Russia and France would be Britain's allies against Germany and Austria-Hungary, they would have said, you're mad. But British elite brought that about. The Cecil Group and the Rhodes-Milner people. The Economist goes on. The accession soon afterwards of the first North African country, Morocco, helped to prolong Europe's boom, the first North African country. In the dangerous second decade of the century, when Vladimir Putin returned for a third term as Russian president and stood poised to invade Ukraine, it was the EU that pushed the Obama administration to threaten massive nuclear retaliation. Little Europe threatens nuclear retaliation. The Ukraine crisis became a triumph for the EU foreign minister, prompting the decision to go for a further big round of enlargement. It was ironic that less than a decade later, Russia itself lodged its first formal application for membership. And so it was, eventually it says, that Israel and Palestine became the EU's 49th and 50th members. Interesting numbers. Israel, 49. Palestine, 50. Putin. The big challenge now, says The Economist, same article, is what to do about Russia. Its application has been pending for 15 years. Some say it's too big, too poor, and not European to join. But now that the Tsar has been symbolically restored, Russia has an impeccably democratic government. Sorry? The Tsar has been restored? Russia has like Britain, of course, constitutional monarchy. Yeah? That's what they're presumably saying. A previous Tsar saved Europe from Napoleon nearly 250 years ago. It would be apt to mark the anniversary by welcoming Russia back into the Russian fold. But you see, already in 1992, the same magazine, The Economist, had put forward a scenario which envisaged that in a great world conflict that would break out precisely in the year 2011, a rolling world conflict, precisely the year 2011, that year specifically mentioned, in 1992, as a result of this, Russia would shrink from its present Pacific borders to the Urals. So Russia would lose all of its territory east of the Urals. This the Economist envisaged in 1992 already. So this Russia, shorn of its Asian Siberian territories, could now be welcomed back into the Euro fold, which of course is under the control of the United States. We can see here, you can see yourself, the amount of hatred which is directed by the British establishment through a media tool, instrument, strumpet, like The Economist, against the Russians. Just look at those images and those slogans of how Putin is described. Putin spy, Putin gangster, Putin tyrant, Putin devil, Putin, you name it. Of course, Putin's no saint. I wouldn't want to say that. But the amount of hatred which has been there in the British elite against Russia for near 200 years now has been formidable. And so we come to this question of whether we, as the British people, wish to go on with this vicarious imperial role, which we've sort of become the Robin to America's Batman. We've become satisfied with this role. At least our elite have. They're happy to play that role. And the result of that role is that the HMS Queen Elizabeth is costing us £6.2 billion, pounds, because we feel, our elite feels, we have to have that. And they say, well, it's good for jobs. But of course, we all know that's not, or we should know, that's not the real reason. It's for this nonsense about being strong enough to, punch above our weight, and all of this ridiculous alpha male talk, to assist the Americans, to provide a fig leaf where necessary. And estimates vary, but 167 billion or 205 billion, which not all, but the great majority of our parliamentarians voted to renew last year, the Trident program. Did you catch it, that in June 2016, a Trident missile veered off in the wrong direction towards America after being launched from HMS Vengeance, one of our 4 nuclear-armed submarines? Did you know that? Off the coast of Florida. The incident was not revealed until January 2017. The Sunday Times reported that Downing Street had covered up the incident just weeks before the crucial House of Commons vote on the future of the missile system. Remember that? They took that vote just a couple of weeks after we were all sort of in a state of exhaustion after Brexit. And then Cameron just slips that vote in there and off he goes. So we're now committed to spending this phenomenal amount of money. We can ask ourselves, what could we do with that amount of money if we weren't spending it on this weapon to annihilate the population of European Russia? That's what it is. Weapon of genocide and mass destruction. Okay, now I move to the solution. Because we have to decide, we the British people have to decide whether we're going to go on with this addiction to world power or not. Or whether we can find a new role, because we still haven't found one. Dean Acheson said, the American Secretary of State, that Britain's lost an empire but hasn't yet found a role. Now, in summer 1917, just before the Bolshevik Revolution, in that revolutionary year, another revolutionary impulse was put forward in Central Europe. Let's see if I can manage this. I have to be careful not to shine this at you. I'm told it's extremely powerful. This man, Otto von Lerchenfeld, whose brother was an envoy, a Bavarian envoy to the government in Berlin. Imperial Germany was a federal state. Not many people remember that. But he therefore had access to seeing the absolute chaotic state in which Germany was at that time, and the whole chaos of the war, and nobody had a clue in the government. And he really felt the war has to end. We have to find a way to end this war peacefully and honorably. And so he went to his spiritual teacher, Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian philosopher and spiritual philosopher who created this spiritual movement called anthroposophy, or spiritual science. And he asked him, how can this war be ended in a way that benefits everyone? And Steiner's point was, well, the problem is that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians and Hungarians are not fighting for anything valuable. They're only fighting for survival. They have no inspiring cultural or spiritual goal to put beside the false illusionary dreams of Woodrow Wilson, for example. And so Steiner put forward, had lots of meetings with Lerchenfeld, and put to him the ideas of what later became the threefold social organism. I'll explain that in a minute. And together with these other two pupils of his, Ludwig Polzer-Hoditz, whose brother Arthur was the chief secretary of the Austro-Hungarian government, and the young Walter Johannes Stein, these were the three men to whom he first communicated the threefold social organism. They first tried a top-down tack. So they used their personal contacts to meet members of the government. This is Richard von Kuhlmann, Steiner met him, German foreign minister. This is Georg Heinrich von Bernstorff, former German ambassador to the United States before World War I. Steiner met him. And this is Max von Baden. He was the last chancellor of Imperial Germany. So Steiner met all these three men and tried to interest them in the ideas of threefolding. Sadly, their ideas were so conservative that they could not find their way to embrace it, because one of the things, as Kuhlmann realized, one of the things it would require would be, for example, the abdication of the Kaiser. That would be one of the logical consequences. Well, Steiner said, well, if that's what has to happen. If the Kaiser has to go, he has to go. So that was the summer of 1914 when this revolutionary impulse first came forward. Steiner is a sort of remarkable person. He's a kind of bit like Aristotle in a way. That's why I put the picture of Aristotle there, a bit of polymath. And it was in the last phase of his activity, from 1917 onwards, that he really, starting out from philosophy and epistemology, that he focused on really on social, what you could call social activities in the fullness of the whole dimension of social activities, including education, farming, and so forth. And then he said something very radical in 1919, when after the Treaty of Versailles and the victory of the Americans and the Brits. The Anglo-American element, he said, may well achieve world dominion, outer physical dominion. But without the threefolding of society, this Anglo-American dominion will flood the world with the death of culture and the sickness of culture. And I think, it's not too difficult to see how that has really happened. And he said, if the Anglo-Americans are not able to bring something spiritual, a new spiritual impulse, to put alongside their external political and economic dominion, then humanity is in for a very, very hard time. We're in for simply more catastrophes, more wars. And that has simply happened, has it not? So what did he mean? He wrote these memoranda, these top-down memoranda to give to these members of the governments of Central Europe, but that did not work. So then from 1919, he tried the bottom-up approach. So he started appealing to workers organizations, middle-class organizations. He made appeals through the press. And basically he said, well, first of all, we've got to understand that the threefolding is not just an idea which has been dreamed up by him or by some academics in a study. It's something, first of all, we have to realize has been unfolding over the last 3,000 years. And in a nutshell, what that means is that we see in cultures such as, for example, ancient China, ancient Japan, ancient Egypt, we see how the emperor or the ruler is regarded as a demigod. It's like a divine being on earth. The priesthood are they who organize the whole of society. And this goes on for a certain time. Forgive me, I have to really make this short. But then we see how gradually this principle of oneness of the one divine or semi-divine ruler then is supplanted, or it's joined by aristocratic rule, the rule of a few, aristocrats or oligarchy, the military impulse. And along with that comes the commercial or trading impulse. And along with that, a little bit later, by the time of the Greeks and Romans, comes the whole body of law, the legal, juridical system. So from a cultural principle of oneness in ancient times, we moved around about by the time of Christ, we have come to a situation where we have a society, particularly, say, here in the West, where you have twofoldness. And we see how that goes on through the Middle Ages. And then from the end of the Middle Ages, particularly, say, 1600, the beginnings of central banking, the beginnings of the founding of the great trading companies, the Dutch and the English, the East India Company, for example, we begin to see the beginnings of what we now recognize as a business sphere, an economic sphere. So just as the political realm, the political sphere, had gradually emancipated itself from what we could call the religious sphere, the sphere which looked for inspiration from the divine, then it became the sphere of inspiration is so-called from the law. The king, the ruler, becomes a mere token of the divine and not the divine himself. Then we see the third sphere is much more down to earth, where you have human beings seeking to exploit the natural world for their own personal benefit in the economic realm. This is the problem, because this phase has not yet, of course, finished. The economic realm has not yet emancipated itself fully from the political realm, and in some cases not even in a country like Iran, for example, or even arguably China, from the cultural realm, if you think of the Communist Party as a kind of an ideological or spiritually led group. So we're still in this phase where the third element is not yet fully separate from the other two, has not yet become autonomous from the other two. And the problem, this is where we have so many of our problems, because this third element is so much influenced by the habits of thinking from the second phase, Steiner pointed out, the political phase, the military phase. So much of our business culture is still rooted in medieval militarism, you could say, with its business attitudes, its business culture. In Japan, for example, the businessmen even regard a necktie as a samurai sword. I kid you not. And I was a long time in Japan, and I've got quite familiar with it. It's my second home almost. And that's how Japanese businessmen see themselves, as modern-day samurai. So it's not only in the West, yeah, that you just have this hangover, this continuing habits from the medieval time into our time. And so one could also say that another habit from that time, of course, is competition. And Steiner's point was that in the economic realm, in the age of industrialism, to have an economy fueled by competition is insanity. Because the fundamental principle, what really drives the economy in the modern age is actually the principle of cooperation. Or we could say cooperation and service. Those are the proper fundaments of business and cooperation. Even in companies which compete furiously against each other, they're only able, after all, are they not, to compete because within themselves they cooperate. Nobody cooperates more than Japanese corporations within their corporations. Against their business opponents, it's war to the knife. But within, the degree of cooperation is formidable. Thank you. So Steiner's point was that we have an economy which is immoral, an economy which is thoroughly self-centered, because it's basing itself on the wrong principle. That principle is the principle of the self, the principle of liberty. So if you think of those three abstract slogans of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, it's the liberty of the Reformation, the spiritual liberty of the individual wanting to be free to worship God in his own way, that was then applied first to politics, where it is also out of bounds, so to speak. It is in the wrong place, because the real basis of politics is the balance of interests, I and thou, my interests and your interests, and how can they come into a mutual relationship? Yeah, two-ness. This is the equality is the fundamental principle of economics. Of politics and the legal sphere. Whereas economics, it is really the we, it is the fraternity. And that, of course, makes many people on the right anxious because they think, socialist, communist. No. Socialists and communists, unfortunately, were also so stuck in the thinking of the Middle Ages, Karl Marx in particular, that they believed that only the state could protect people from rapacious, self-centered capitalism. It seemed like that. But what we found that from the 19th century was that the state took in more and more parts of the society into its orbit. And this simply has worked, as we've seen in the 20th century, into a disaster because politicians and bureaucrats simply cannot run health services. They cannot run education systems. They cannot run businesses. So we have today a system where the three spheres of our life, the cultural sphere, cultural spiritual sphere, the political, juridical, legal sphere, and the economic sphere are all hopelessly mixed up and interfering with each other. Think of the various ways in which business interferes with and influences politics. We all know that's wrong. Or the ways in which the government interferes in the business world. The question is, how can the business world how can that become ethical? And it can become ethical if the cultural realm, Steiner pointed out, can be free to develop in its own way. And if the state is restricted to what the state should properly do, which basically means the military, the police, the prisons, the borders, and the laws. But also the laws in relation to the business world. The state has to underpin the laws of contract upon which economic life is based. So I must come to an end. And so essentially you see that what he said is essential that we do is to separate these three systems of society and prevent and stop them being so hopelessly mixed up so they can all become autonomous in their own way, and then they can healthily interrelate in a dynamic way, just as the three systems of our physical bodies interact in a dynamic way: the metabolism, the heart and lung circulation system, and the nerve sense system. They're all working together, but they're all autonomous. That is, they do not interfere with each other. If they did, we'd soon become ill. And that's what we have. We have a sick society. We're just waiting for the next crash. We're waiting for the next war. And that's because business and economy are connected, are completely intermeshed, and they have to be separated. That's what led to World War I and World War II. So I'll close with these words. If the British people do not awaken to how we have been led and manipulated by that element within us, which I personally would argue alighted on our shores in the year 1066 with Duke William and his conquering Normans, then our rulers will indeed continue to lead us, the Americans, the Europeans in general, and the whole of the West to disaster. The British people must now decide, each one of them, whether, as citizens responsible for the actions of our national community and state, whether we can embrace a very different role. Each of us is now faced with the choice that Prospero faced in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Namely, is Britain to continue to practice the rough magic of power, technology, over the natural elements in order to dominate those it believes to be its enemies? Or is it to abjure that rough magic, to abjure egocentric insularity and return to the continent to which it belongs in order to make its own unique contribution towards the remaking of a Europe that is dominated neither by Rome, Alta or Nova, or by Byzantium? Not a return to a Holy Roman Empire in a new centralist all-controlling form, the EU, but a move to an associative European community that can help other regions of the world to see how nations can cooperate culturally and economically while retaining their own political and legal character, their national sovereignty in the political and legal realm, their traditions and their cultural independence. Steiner pointed out 90 years how this could be done through the realization of the threefolding of society. On my website, you'll find a list of the various organizations, books, and magazines, and so on. Excuse me, skipping back. This website here, if you want to find out more about threefolding. Steiner pointed out in 1922 that the window of opportunity for threefolding had ceased. Social affairs changed very rapidly, but 1922 was not 1917. He said, now we have to focus on the cultural sphere. And so he put his work more in that direction. But he said in 100 years' time, another window will open for the threefolding. And that's because 100 years on, we see how the state, which was the false god, by fascists, by communists, and by capitalist Democrats 100 years ago, everybody believed in the state. And we've seen how the state has proved to be a false god in the intervening 100 years. So that window of opportunity for threefolding has now opened again, because now people realize we are desperate. We need a new way forward, a new guiding impulse. And this is an impulse which is not based on animalism, not based on Darwinist survival of the fittest, and it's not based on mere abstractions. It's rooted in the human being and the human organism and human history. So I thank you very much for listening, and please interest yourselves in the threefolding if you have a will to do so. Thank you very much.
Terry Boardman.